Welcome to Day Historic, and we will be talking about Cold War. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension between the US and the Soviet Union and their respective allies, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. The term Cold War is used because there was no large-scale fighting directly between the two superpowers, but they each supported opposing sides in major regional conflicts. Started a gradual winding down with the Sino-Soviet split between the Soviets, and the subvolutes of the Cold War can be traced back to diplomatic and military tensions preceding World War II. The Cold War began with the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in 1947. The 1917 Russian Revolution and the subsequent Treaty of Brest-Litovsk deepened distrust among the Western Allies. The Soviet Union's establishment of communist regimes in the countries it had liberated from Nazi control alarmed the US and UK. Major crises of this phase included the Berlin blockade of 1948, 1949, the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1945, 1949, the Korean War of 1950, 1953, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and the Suez Crisis of that same year in 1961. Soviet allied East Germany constructed the Berlin Wall to prevent the citizens of East Berlin from fleeing to West Berlin. In the 1960s, the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact members gained significant scope to pursue their own interests. In 1946, Kennan's long telegram from Moscow to Washington helped to articulate the US government's increasingly hard line against the Soviets. Washington's opposition to the Soviets accumulated after broken promises by Stalin and Molotov concerning Europe and Iran. Soviet territorial demands to Turkey regarding the Dardanelles in the Turkish Straits crisis were also a major factor in increasing tensions. In 1946, James F. Burns warned the Soviets that the US intended to maintain a military presence in Europe indefinitely. By 1947, US President Harry S. Truman was outraged by the perceived resistance of the Soviet Union to American demands in Iran, Turkey, and Greece. Truman delivered a speech calling for the allocation of $400 million to intervene in the war and unveiled the Truman Doctrine, which framed the conflict as a contest between free peoples and totalitarian regimes. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan led to billions in economic and military aid for Western Europe, Greece, and Turkey. All major powers engaged in espionage using a great variety of spies, double agents, moles, and new technologies such as the tapping of telephone cables. The Soviet KGB was the bureau responsible for foreign espionage and internal surveillance. The most famous Soviet operation involved its atomic spies that delivered crucial information from the United States Manhattan Project. A massive network of informants throughout the Soviet Union was used to monitor dissent from official Soviet politics and morals. Until the break between Tito and Stalin, the Western powers and the Eastern Bloc faced each other uncompromisingly. Active measures were clandestine operations designed to further Soviet foreign policy goals during the Sino-Soviet split. Spy wars also occurred between the USSR and PRC Korea. Stalin repeatedly proposed a plan to unify East and West Germany under a single government chosen in elections supervised by the United Nations. But this proposal was turned down by the Western powers' media in the Eastern Bloc with an organ of the state. Completely reliant on and subservient to the Communist Party, Soviet radio broadcasts used Marxist rhetoric to attack capitalism. American policymakers acknowledged that the Cold War was in its essence a war of ideas. The United States, acting through the CIA, funded a long list of projects to counter the communist appeal among intellectuals in Europe and the developing world. The CIA also covertly sponsored a domestic propaganda campaign called Crusade for Freedom Truman, under the influence of advisor Pornitzer, so containment as implying complete rollback of Soviet influence in all its forms. United States officials moved to expand this version of containment into Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In order to counter revolutionary nationalist movements in 1953, changes in political leadership on both sides shifted the dynamic of the Cold War. Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated president that January in 1956. he denounced Joseph Stalin and proceeded to ease controls over the party and society. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 occurred shortly after Khrushchev arranged the removal of Hungary's Stalinist leader Matthias Sarkozy. In response to a popular anti-communist uprising, the new regime formally disbanded the secret police and declared its intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. The events in Hungary produced ideological fractures within the communist parties of the world. Particularly in Western Europe, Kennedy's foreign policy was dominated by confrontations with the Soviet Union. Like Truman and Eisenhower, Kennedy supported containment to stop the spread of communism. Kennedy implemented a new strategy known as flexible response. The pro-Western Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, assumed control as an autocratic monarch. The Shah's policies included banning the Communist Tudeh Party of Iran and general suppression of political dissent. The non-aligned Indonesian government of Sukarno was faced with a major threat to its legitimacy. The island again won the colonial elections in 1957 and 1961. Despite Britain's shift to a reconsideration of its view of the left-wing Jagan as a Soviet-style communist, the United States pressured the British to withhold Guyana's independence until an alternative to Jagan could be identified. The Porter then brought into office Sputnik's launch inaugurated the space race. The public's reaction in the Soviet Union was mixed. The Berlin crisis of 1961 was the last major incident in the Cold War regarding the status of Berlin and post-World War II Germany. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. The aftermath led to efforts in the nuclear arms race at nuclear disarmament and improving relations. The Cold War's first arms control agreement, the Antarctic Treaty, had come into force in 1961. The Vietnam War descended into a quagmire for the United States, leading to a decline in international prestige and economic stability. America's withdrawal from the war led it to embrace a policy of detente with both China and the Soviet Union. The Tet Offensive of 1968 proved to be the turning point of the war. 1968. A period of political liberalization took place in Czechoslovakia called the Prague Spring on 20 August 1968. The Soviet army, together with most of their Warsaw Pact allies, invaded Prague. The invasion sparked intense protests from Yugoslavia, Romania, China, and from Western European countries. Richard Nixon decided to use the conflict to shift the balance of power towards human rights activists in the Soviet Union, were regularly subjected to harassment. As a result of the Sino-Soviet split, tensions along the Chinese-Soviet border reached their peak in 1969. Repressions and arrests, a more hammer of Occidental petroleum, often mediated trade relations. Kissinger and Nixon were realists who de-emphasized idealistic goals in 1973. Nixon announced his administration was committed to seeking most favored nation trade status with the USSR. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was attached to the 1974 Trade Act, linked the granting of most favored nation to the USSR to the right of persecuted Soviet Jews to emigrate. Operation Storm 333 was one of the most successful in the Soviet Union's history. 30 Afghan palace guards and over 300 army guards were killed, while another 150 were captured. In the aftermath of the operation, a total of 700 Afghan soldiers who surrendered to Soviet forces were taken as prisoners. The CIA sought to weaken the Soviet Union by promoting Islamism in the majority Muslim Central Asian Soviet Union. The CIA encouraged anti-communist Pakistan's ESI to train Muslims from around the world to participate in the jihad against the Soviets. The Soviet armed forces became the largest in the world in terms of the numbers and types of weapons they possessed. By the early 1980s, the USSR had built up a military arsenal and army surpassing that of the United States. Reagan revived the B-1 Lancer program, produced LGM-118 peacekeeper missiles, installed those cruise missiles in Europe, and announced the Experimental Strategic Defense Initiative on 1 September 1983. The Soviet Union shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7, a Boeing 747 with 269 people aboard, including sitting Congressman Larry McDonald. At the same time, Saudi Arabia increased oil production, even as other non-OPEC nations were increasing production. These developments contributed to the 1980s oil. The Reagan administration emphasized the use of quick, low-cost counterinsurgency tactics to intervene in foreign conflicts. Reagan's interventions against Grenada and Libya were popular in the United States, while Reagan's backing of the Contra rebels was mired in controversy. The Soviets incurred high costs for their own foreign interventions. Gorbachev introduced glasnost or openness, which increased freedom of the press and the transparency of state institutions. Glasnost was intended to reduce the corruption at the top of the Communist Party and moderate the abuse of power in the Central Committee. Gorbachev and Bush declared the Cold War over at the Malta summit on 3 December 1989. Mikhail Gorbachev made significant changes in the economy and party leadership called perestroika. His policy of glasnost freed public access to information after decades of heavy government censorship. The standstill of the Soviet Union at the Pan-European picnic in August 1989 then set a peaceful chain reaction in motion, at the end of which the Eastern Bloc collapsed. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 symbolized the collapse of European communist governments. The communist regimes in Bulgaria and Romania also crumbled, in the latter case as the result of a violent uprising. At the same time, the Soviet Republic started legal moves towards potentially declaring sovereignty over their territories, citing the freedom to secede in Article 72 of the USSR Constitution in August 1991. Latvia and Estonia immediately declared the restoration of their full independence by the fall. Gorbachev could no longer influence events outside Moscow. Russia assumed the Soviet Union's UN membership and permanent membership on the Security Council. Nuclear stockpile and control over the armed forces decommunization in Russia has been restricted to half measures. If conducted at all, nostalgia for the Soviet Union is gradually on the rise in Russia. Communist symbols continue to form an important part of the rhetoric used in state-controlled media, as banning on them in the countries is seen as sacrilege post-Cold War. The world is considered to be unipolar, with the United States the sole remaining superpower. The Cold War defined the political role of the US. After World War II, cumulative US military expenditures throughout the entire Cold War amounted to an estimated $8 trillion. Cold War endures as a popular topic reflected in entertainment media. In 2013, a KGB sleeper agents living next door action drama series, The Americans, set in the early 1980s, was ranked No. 6 on the Metacritic annual Best New TV Shows list. Orthodox accounts place responsibility for the Cold War on the Soviet Union and its expansion further into Europe. Revisionist writers place more responsibility on the United States. Thanks for watching the video. See you next time.